Ladies and gentlemen, you're now watching a live video feed. This is happening right now. Dozens of odd creatures have descended from the hole in the sky and have begun a rampage across the city.
In Dragon Ball GT, if you freeze a very specific frame, you will see that Cooler makes a cameo appearance. And this is when all of the previous Dragon Ball villains from the past were coming to threaten the Earth. Now, as a post-edit upon editing this video, I never noticed initially that in the second frame of all of the villains coming back that King Cold is actually in the top right corner. So take the points that you're going to hear me make about Cooler in this video and also apply them to King Cold as well. Which of course is very similar to what we saw in the movie Dragon Ball Z Fusion Reborn, in which, once again, previous villains were threatening the Earth because Janemba upset the balance of the living world and the afterlife, whereas in Dragon Ball GT, the previous villains were coming back to the Earth because the two Android 17s opened up a portal, which essentially gave way for previous villains to come to Earth. And with this, going back many years, even back in the day, this has always been an interesting conversation because Cooler making a cameo appearance in Dragon Ball GT definitely brings up a lot of questions for discussion. One thing is obviously the canonicity. Now, of course, you can easily just debunk this by saying, well, GT's not canon, so anything that GT does doesn't really matter, but when you look at the fact that Dragon Ball GT is clearly based off of the original Dragon Ball Z anime canon, even though it's clearly not based off of the Dragon Ball manga, but it's clearly based off of the Dragon Ball Z anime continuity, it then brings into question, well, Cooler's coming back, but Cooler was a movie villain, so what even is canon to canon to canon to canon in this specific situation? And if Cooler was to come back from the anime canon or the movie canon in this particular situation, that would also bring up, well, what about the other Dragon Ball Z movie villains that just never showed up? Or maybe they did show up, but they were just simply killed off screen. And of course, this was clearly just meant to be a little cameo to give fans some fun, kind of like you play those games back in the day where it's like, where's Waldo? And you look at like a page and try to find him on it, and it's like, oh, if you freeze the screen really quickly, you'll see that Cooler's actually there. If you compare this to something that we saw in Fusion Reborn, one weird thing about all of this is that when all of the previous villains were coming back, we saw a mixture of them, and one thing that we see is Bojack comes back. Why is Bojack taking orders from Frieza to attack Earth's heroes? Wouldn't you think it'd be the other way around, considering the fact that Bojack is way stronger than Frieza? But then you can argue at the same time that Frieza got a lot stronger in the afterlife, so maybe he actually had authority over Bojack, or maybe Bojack was just there. It's just one of those situations where it's clearly meant to just have fun and do a cameo appearance, but it is interesting to believe that Bojack would be taking orders from Frieza, looking at the Janemba movie specifically. But when we go back to Cooler, Cooler's stronger than Frieza, at least what we originally saw. Now, clearly, in Dragon Ball Super, of course, Frieza got a lot more powerful because he trained before he attacked Earth in Resurrection of F, and then he did like mental training the second time around before he fought in the Tournament of Power, so Frieza clearly got a boost, and the show and the manga gave a reason to explain exactly how Frieza got that much more powerful. But originally, if you consider the fact that the original Dragon Ball continuity said that Cooler was stronger than Frieza, that kind of brings into question, well, who would have just been able to wipe Cooler out on planet Earth? Now, of course, Frieza and Cell were reserved for Goku to go into the afterlife and fight them in hell, essentially. But the interesting thing about Cooler is that he should be right there with Frieza and Cell, especially, as we already pointed out before, he should be stronger than Frieza. And this now leaves a question, if he really did come back to Earth, who exactly killed him? Well, the answer's probably one of two people. It's clearly not Gohan, because specifically, if you look at Gohan, he was fighting against General Rildo the majority of the time that the previous villains were coming back, so he never really would have had time to fight anybody else, especially if Rildo was giving him that much trouble. And considering the fact that this version of Gohan doesn't even seem like he could even go Super Saiyan 2 anymore, because all of the Dragon Ball GT Saiyans besides Goku and Vegeta basically seem to be restricted to Super Saiyan 1, it doesn't seem like Gohan would have put up a good fight. Now, it's crazy to believe this because it's hard to calculate exactly how much weaker Gohan got in Dragon Ball GT, so maybe he's still strong enough to fight against a character like Cooler, but if Cooler got a lot more powerful and Gohan got a lot weaker over the years of having even more peace stacked off of, you know, the gap that he would have slacked off anyways in Dragon Ball Z or near the end of Dragon Ball GT, the 10-year time skip, then we have to look at that continuity differently, because in the original Dragon Ball continuity, before Super essentially put itself into that gap, it was assumed that everybody was just living peacefully, so there really wouldn't have been much training for Gohan. So that ultimately leaves that the two characters that would have stood the best chance to defeat him would have been Oob or Vegeta. Oob, obviously, because he had already fused with Boo, and Vegeta, obviously, because he's the second strongest main character at this particular point in time. Now, something else about this whole cameo appearances of all of the previous villains that always kind of looked weird was that Android 19 was brought back. Now, obviously, if we want to analyze this a little bit deeper here, the interesting thing about this is that Android 19, as we thought, was supposed to be completely mechanical. So when Android 19 dies, it's kind of like, well then how would he come back to life? He's essentially just like Android 16 in that particular sense. Whereas when you look at a character like Dr. Gero, you can argue because of his brain and being transformed into an android via Android 19 surgery, maybe he still had organic material to consider him a soul, even though his body was transformed. So you can kind of make an argument, you know, with Dr. Gero or even a character like Dr. Mew, but with Android 19, because he was purely mechanical, that kind of brings into question, well, how did he come back? And when you look at a character like General Rildo, who was originally an alien, but then he got transformed into more of like a mutant type character, it kind of can make sense how General Rildo was able to return. But specifically looking at Android 19, that's definitely something that would break the laws of Dragon Ball, because now we have a situation where it's like, well, why wasn't Android 16 resurrected when all of Cell's victims came back? Because 16's just as mechanical as 19. Just some food for thought. Now, something else too that we also see is that Captain Ginyu is brought back in his Ginyu body, which is kind of a weird thing to say, his Ginyu body, because that's clearly not his original body, because the question I've always brought up to prove whether or not Captain Ginyu was ever in his original body is, how do you practice a body change technique? Obviously, Ginyu must have stolen his body from some alien in the first place, but then when you see Ginyu in the body that he had on Namek, that now brings up, well then what happened to the frog Ginyu? Did he not get wished back over the many times that people died on planet Earth? And then now this brings up something that we saw in the Super continuity, where in the Super continuity, I mean, he just basically switched bodies with Tagomo, but that never really happened in the movie continuity. But specifically, the existence of Captain Ginyu being in the afterlife brings up a lot of questions in regards to not only his body, but also what happened to the frog variant. But ultimately, the biggest question of all when it comes to discussing Cooler is really, why didn't he destroy planet Earth? Now, of course, the honest answer is that we're not supposed to overanalyze it, but it's fun to think about this, because when you look at Cooler, he can breathe in outer space. Right? He has absolutely no reason to just go to Earth and fight against the other heroes just like he had died before, and he obviously learned his lesson because he was killed. So you'd think Cooler can kind of pull like a King Cole and say, let's just wipe out the planet from outer space while all of the other heroes are too busy fighting against other people. And when you think about it like that, and you consider the fact that Frieza and his race, or his group of people, don't really care or have a lot of empathy or sympathy for other lives, he could simply have just destroyed the entire planet, and the other characters all would have died too, because they would have been too busy fighting against other characters, and as a result of it, Cooler could essentially have won the entire fight by simply just not giving a crap, because of the fact that he could blow up the Earth and not worry about his own life because he can survive in space, just as we saw with Frieza and King Cole's genes. And as a result of this, the entire Dragon Ball GT battle was fought and he was killed off screen, but the entire time he could have wiped out the entire planet and gave the villains a big W and victory, even though they all would have died too because they would have been killed in the explosion, but it wouldn't really matter because if they die, they go back to the afterlife, they go back to hell, and if the portal's still somehow open, even though the planet would be destroyed, so the portal would still be gone. But if the 17th could somehow make another portal or somehow create a gate between hell and the afterlife or the living world, then we have an interesting situation where there's no real penalty for dying anymore because the villains could simply just come back if you can find another planet or some other way to just bring them back. So it's like, hey, you guys can die temporarily, but don't really worry about it because you're all gonna come back. And guys, that is what we call overanalyzing Dragon Ball. Now, as a post-edit, after freezing the original frame of Android 19 in Cooler, if you look very, very, very closely in the top left corner, it appears that this character is Raditz, based off of how long his hair appears, and also based off of the fact that it seems like he's wearing a Saiyan battle uniform. And if this is truly Raditz, this would have been the last time that we saw him in Dragon Ball history, even if you say this is not canon. But just to have a little bit of fun, I'm going to show you 2 direct frames of all of the villains coming back, and I'm curious how many of these characters you can identify, especially the background characters that have a lot less detail. We see another scene too, where Trunks comes in to save Goten from Yakan when he destroys him with an energy blast, and both of them killed 19 with energy blasts. But can't both of those villains absorb energy?